non-military, with diplomacy, with sanctions, with mobilizing the international community. Disastrous for him. Because you see, you don't talk about solving the Palestine-Israel conflict unless you think ahead of time what it's going to take. Because if you raise the yardstick and you don't, you know, it's like saying you're going to promote democracy and people really don't get it in your head. Yeah, you can make some criticism of the Egyptian government and of this other government, but are you really going to be willing when it looks like they might be voted out, where you're going to come down, to think that through? So, of course, the Bush administration couldn't deliver. Mr. Obama came in, and he promised a vigorous pursuit of both defending Israel, but having a Palestinian state, and resolving that in his first term. Now, the word in Washington, both from members of the administration, from the Senate and others, is second term. Now, think about this. Not only do you have the whole history, and you have people who've been living in the camps 3 or 4 generations, but just take the example of Haiti. Suppose we announce tomorrow, we've done a fair amount in Haiti. This is still horrific, but let me tell you, we're coming back in 3 years. Obama says, Haiti is #1 on my agenda, but in my second term. Right now, in the interim, it's jobs, 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 and we can't address it. On Palestine and Israel, the president cannot afford to be put in a position where that issue is not addressed. Obviously, he's got problems. The leadership on both sides is nothing to write home about. To have a combination of Netanyahu and Lieberman is beyond belief. To have Abbas and Haniyeh and the inability of Palestinians to put it together, okay? But if we're going to be that middle that's going to try to be the trusted negotiator, then we have to act like it, and we're not. The administration talks about a freeze on settlements. It should have been an abolition of those that are illegal. A freeze, that's not exactly, a horrific first step. Netanyahu ignores him, says we're not going to listen to it. Then he announces an almost freeze. At the same time, land is being taken over in the West Bank. Moves are being made moves are being made in the West Bank, and also the siege continues of Gaza. This is an enormous problem for the president. It's absolutely contentious. We know this in America itself. You have a new movement led by Jews, but also non-Jews, called J Street. But even that, for some, for many American Jews, and for some Israelis, is not acceptable. So even within the Jewish community, this diversity within that community is an issue, let alone among Palestinians when they talk about what they want. But the problem we have is that we have a seasoned negotiator in Senator Mitchell, but one who has no teeth. And he's not given that teeth by his Secretary of State. And like it or not, although the Secretary of State should be relatively independent, it's President Obama's watch, and there has to be a move made on it. Okay, where does this bring us in terms of the conclusion? Well, in the good old days, one could give a speech and talk about a light at the end of the tunnel. Well, the tunnel remains very long. And the light is way still in the distance. The challenge for President Obama is going to be, as with the economy, whether or not he's willing to do what needs to be done, let the American people speak, and as he said the other day, risk that he could be a one-term president. No politician, no matter how good, has ever been willing to operate that way. So that becomes a major issue. For our part, in terms of our conduct of foreign policy, we have to look much more closely at how we engage in the region, i.e., American military presence has to be pulled out as fast as can occur, because all it's going to mean is more dead Americans and lots more dead local people, and it's not going to be any great resolution. If anybody can talk about a time frame for turning Afghanistan around, please let us know during the question and answer period. I mean, it is just, look at what happened. The Afghans joined together, drove out the Soviets. Everybody expected them now to put in place a government. They then fought a civil war for another 10 years in which the carnage was greater than occurred under the previous. Then the Taliban came. Now look at where we are. 30,000 troops, additional troops, are not going to do that. On the other hand, America and Europe has to take a lead in dealing with authoritarian regimes in the region. They have to use a carrot and stick approach in order to get these regimes to open up the political system and to build civil societies. What they've done in recent years is that regimes now use the fig leaf of democracy. So, for example, if you're at the World Economic Forum, as I was, people were saying civil society is important. Because see, when you don't want to have people move to democracy too fast, I think that's the way the British felt about the Americans. So we fought a bloody revolution and an even bloodier civil war. But somehow it was okay for us, but for other people it's like, you don't want to rush into democracy, there could be a little chaos, a little bloodshed with the French Revolution. So the hint was, don't promote democracy now. That's a way of supporting your authoritarian regimes. Promote civil society. But as one of my colleagues said, what authoritarian regime wants a strong civil society? You know, human rights groups, free political parties. So what happens at the World Economic Forum? Civil society's in, Egyptians get up and say, we've increased exponentially our NGOs. But what they don't tell you is in Egypt, they're government-regulated, non-government organizations. Government-regulated, non-government organizations. And in Jordan, they're called royal NGOs under the new day. So we've got to think about how we deal with those authoritarian regimes. On the other hand, Muslims have to deal with the issues of how to marginalize extremism, how to engage in de-radicalization, which is occurring, but it's got to occur on an even grander scale. We have to be more informed. How many of you would love to ask me, and maybe you're thinking of asking me, or would at least regard it as a legitimate question to ask me, why haven't Muslims spoken out more against terrorism, against 9/11 and terrorist attacks? Raise your hands. Good. It's a very good question. But then you got to ask yourself, why don't you know that they have? Because in fact, from 9/12, while there were those who celebrated the attacks, from the day after, there were major statements made by major religious leaders. They are to be found on the internet. You can find them in my new book, published last week, called The Future of Islam. I've got the websites there. Major statements have been made. How many of you have ever heard of the Amman message? How many of you have heard of Common Word? These are all major statements that are out there. How many of you read Tom Friedman's columns in the New York Times, or have heard of Tom Friedman? Okay. Tom Friedman has written twice in the last 5 years raising that question. Until they speak out, okay? Twice I have written to the New York Times and said, Tom, you're too bright to be that stupid, which is what my father would always say to his sons. When we got older, got our degrees and disagreed with them. And basically say, Tom, you've got researchers. You've got to know this, but here are the websites. You want to see all the statements that have been out there? That letter never gets published. 5 years later, Tom Friedman makes the same statement. The fact is, media are driven, and it's understandable, by conflict, by conflictual discourse. Put your TV on in the morning. What are the first things we see? It's conflict that grabs. The reality of it is, these statements do not get published. In the midst of this question, why don't they speak out? 300 leaders, Muslim leaders from all over the world, addressed the issue of violence, terrorism, and extremism. Reuters covered it. The Washington Post gave it one paragraph. No other major American newspaper covered it at all. So we've got a lot of work to do. And the work, in terms of the theme of tonight, is to realize that just as you don't equate all Americans with what some American presidents might do, you don't equate all Jews or Judaism with the fact that you had a terrorist, or actually a religious zealot, who in the name of religion assassinated their Prime Minister Rabin. You had another zealot, Baruch Goldstein, who walked into a mosque in Hebron and slaughtered Muslims praying. We don't say, there go those Jews again. That's Judaism. We don't equate the injustices of Catholicism from the Inquisition to pedophilia, or of Catholics, okay, to all of Catholicism. The same kind of distinction has to be made when we deal with the vast majority of Islam and Muslims. Otherwise, the risk is we undermine the civil liberties of our fellow citizens at home, and we endanger the mainstream